Rishi Sunak, the man who wants to lead the Conservatives, the man who wants to be Prime Minister. Do his policies add up? Is his judgment sound? Is his character all he claims it to be? It's time to find out. Welcome to a special edition of the Andrew Neil Show, focusing on the race to be Prime Minister. And one of the two people still in the running, Rishi Sunak. Good evening.
Good evening, Andrew.
Let's start with your judgment, or lack of. Why did you persist with multi-billion-pound tax rises this year when it was already clear the UK economy was heading for a major slowdown?
Well, this comes back to a fundamental question at the heart of this leadership election, and that's how do we tackle the problems that we racked up during COVID, all the extra borrowing that we had to do to make sure that we got the country through it? And we all knew there'd be a bill to pay. So the question that confronted me and confronts all of us is, what do we do about that? Do we pay those bills ourselves, or do we pass them on to our children and our grandchildren and expect them to pick up the tab? And alongside that, we also have to think about whether we go on a borrowing spree right now, whether that will make the inflation problem worse and push up interest rates. And that's not something that I wanted to do.
But the problem is not 5 or 10 years. The problem is the economic situation now. America is in recession. The Eurozone is on the brink of recession. The Bank of England is tightening monetary policy, which means people's interest rates are going up. And you're now tightening fiscal policy, all designed just to make it worse. You're going to ensure a recession.
No, if you look at what's happening around the world, it's inflation that is slowing economies down. It's rising interest rates that are already putting a brake on economic activity, Andrew. And my concern is that I want to get to grips with inflation as quickly as possible, because inflation makes everybody poorer. It erodes people's living standards.
Yeah, but a recession will make everybody poorer too, and will make it much harder to balance the budget, make it much harder to reduce the fiscal deficit.
Well,
I mean, are you really arguing that your economic position, as the global economy grinds to a halt, as monetary policy is being tightening, that it's the right thing to do to tighten fiscal policy as well?
I think it is absolutely the right thing to do to
So
not
there'll
put
be a recession,
fuel
won't
on
there?
the fire of the inflation problem that we already have.
So there'll be a recession?
Well, actually, that's not the forecast of the majority of most independent forecasters here in the UK. So that's not actually the
But
majority.
you're going to
of
make
what
it
people
more
think.
likely with this approach to the economy.
Well, no, that they're already forecasting that that's not likely to be the case from most of them, actually. But what is right
Well,
is
next
the following.
year, the two big international forecasts say that we won't grow at all next year.
Right, well, let's talk about growth then, if we'd like to talk about growth. How do we grow the economy?
Well, not by putting it in recession, I think, is the first thing.
Well, actually, what we need to do is get to grips with inflation quickly, because if we have inflation that persists for far longer, that's not going to help grow the economy. It's just going to make everybody poorer. And whilst it may make us feel good in the short run, actually, we end up repeating the mistakes of the past. And we've seen how that is. If you borrow tens of billions of pounds, pump that money into an economy, then that fuels inflation, and that pushes up interest rates even higher, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. Now, of course, Andrew, look, listen, it would be the easiest thing in the world for me to sit here and say, no, I don't want to do any of these difficult things. I'd like to give everybody all these nice things. Don't you think that would make my life easier? It's because I genuinely believe it would not be the responsible thing to do that I'm saying that we should go down this course, be careful with our borrowing, manage it carefully, but help people with the cost of living this year, which is what we're doing.
Nobody, Mr. Sunak, is saying that you should go on a massive spending spree. And of course, over time, you need to get the budget deficit down. This is about speed. And you're doing it so quickly that you're going to make things worse. And I wonder what the rush is. After all, among the major economies of the world, which one has higher national or lower national debt than we have?
Well, of those major economies...
Of the G7.
Of the G7?
Which one?
We're in the middle of the pack.
No, we're not actually. Everyone has more debt, bar Germany.
No, that's...
OK, I'll give you the figures. Canada, 118%, the US, 137%, Italy, 151%, Japan, 266%, the UK, 96%, the Eurozone's 96% too, Germany, 70%.
Right. So
Since our national debt is not out of kilter, Why are you in such a rush to get the deficit done?
You want to make these international comparisons. We should go in through those properly, right? What's happening in the US at the moment? Look where interest rates are in the US. I don't want to have interest rates here go higher than they need to be.
But they're
mortgage
going
rates.
up.
Well, I don't want them to go up any higher than they're going to be. Mortgage rates in the US are already 50% higher than they are here. The US also benefits as being the world's reserve currency. You mentioned Japan. Japan funds the majority of its debt internally from its own savers. That's not what we do here in the UK. We have to attract money from around the world to fund our deficit.
Even the OECD.
And let me just finish on this. Well, hang on, let me just finish.
Says that your fiscal stance as Chancellor was too contractionary, that you were cutting the deficit so quickly that you were undermining growth. That's the OECD.
Well, actually, I've set up a very clear plan for growth. And the way we're going to get growth in this economy is by doing the things that actually drive productivity up. And that's by reforming business taxation, so we get companies to invest more. That's what I've said that we will do this autumn. Reform taxation so that companies innovate more and invest in R&D. Deregulate to take advantage of our Brexit freedoms, creating things like free ports, which I've done around the country.
These are all long-term. We're facing a recession now.
Yeah, but what we should do is focus on long-term growth, because that's what we need, sustainable growth, not a sugar rush boom that will make us all feel better for months, but then it runs out of control. Then inflation gets set into the system. Then the Bank of England has to react with even higher interest rates. That's not a good situation for anybody, and we should be very careful about doing things that make that more likely.
Just finally, before I come on, are you saying that the Bank of England would continue to increase rates even if we were in a recession?
The Bank of England's job is to manage inflation and inflation expectations.
But are you saying it would do that?
The Bank of England is independent. But I think it's pretty clear.
So you don't know?
It's pretty clear that if inflation is high, if inflation expectations are running ahead of target, the Bank of England will act forcefully, in their own words, to control that.
You'll solve the inflation problem if you put us into a recession. Let me ask you this, though, on the tax rise.
Andrew, this is...
This is important because it's about families. Because it was clear we were heading for a painful cost of living crisis early this year. You could see it coming. You could see it coming at the end of last year. But the taxes you chose to raise, national insurance and freezing income tax thresholds, they reduced people's take-home pay and made the cost of living crisis even worse.
I also chose to raise taxes on the largest companies in this country.
Well, you're not doing that till next year.
Yeah, and that's going to raise more money than the things
but
that you mentioned. Because I think we had to share the load fairly.
Why? But it's not fair, is it? You chose taxes like national insurance and income tax thresholds that hurt workers, not the affluent retired, not those living on investment income. They don't pay national insurance. You penalised workers.
Well, no, actually, what I did was try and fix the problems that we've got and do it in the fairest way possible. And actually, freezing thresholds, which you mentioned is a policy that I put in place, is a way to do that without affecting people's cash take-home pay. And it's an entirely progressive measure, Andrew. And all the independent experts and commentators described it as progressive at the time.
Because those with
the broader shoulders contribute more. That's what happens when you freeze thresholds.
Freezing thresholds at a time when inflation is rising, you have dragged very low earners into the 20% tax bracket. And before, they didn't pay any tax. You've dragged them into the basic rate of tax for the first time. Why is that fair?
Because freezing thresholds means that those with the broadest shoulders contribute the most.
We're talking about the lowest paid.
Well, the lowest paid have benefited from the tax cuts that I've put in place. Actually, for the 2 million lowest paid in this country who move off welfare and into work, they benefited from a very significant tax cut that I put in place. And just this month, we raised the threshold that those workers that you're talking about start paying any tax on national insurance at all.
That's
a tax cut that is worth £330 a year.
Yeah, that's before you take into account the rise in national insurance as well.
Yeah, but Andrew, also, that way to raise money is undoubtedly, objectively progressive. Now, you might say, you don't need to raise any money and we'd rather just have higher borrowing. That's a completely reasonable position. But if you take the position that we do need to raise the money, I think that is a fair way to do it, alongside asking the largest companies to contribute more as well. And it was described as progressive at the time. But I do want to cut taxes for people in work, which is why under my plans, we will deliver the first income tax cut in 16 years in this Parliament that I've paid for and put in my plans, because hard work is something that I want to reward. And as Prime Minister, I want to go further than that and deliver more income tax cuts.
What is progressive about this? What is rewarding hard work? When by the middle of this decade, 9 million people will be paying the higher 40% tax rate. 1 in 4 taxpayers will be in a tax bracket originally meant for only top earners like yourself. How is that Tory or fair?
Because 75% of people under your numbers, the vast majority of people, will be paying the basic rate of tax. That's the low and middle earners, and that's why I'm delivering a tax cut for those people.
But it was never meant for 25% to be paying the 40%. When your hero, Nigel Lawson, introduced the top rate of 40%, he made it clear it was only for high earners, not for middle earners.
Well, we're in a situation now which is 30 years forward from that, right? So what I'm doing...
You've got a picture of him in your office.
I do. And actually the tax system that I'm trying to deliver is inspired by what he did, which is to have a broad base and lower rates. And that's why I want to cut income tax in this Parliament for the first time in 16 years. And as Prime Minister, over time, as we grow the economy and get to grips with public spending, I want to go further on cutting income tax because I want to reward hard work.
Let's look at another tax in judgment. In February, you told the Commons that cutting VAT on energy bills would, these are your words, disproportionately benefit wealthier households. Now, as your campaign fails to gain traction among Tory members, you propose to suspend VAT on energy bills. It's not just bad judgment, it's lack of consistency.
No, absolutely not. I've always said from the beginning that as we knew more about what energy bills would actually be in the autumn, that I would stand ready to do more. We've already announced, and I announced as Chancellor, significant support for millions of families across the country to help with energy bills.
I understand that.
But now, so what's
changed? You argued against VAT, cutting VAT.
Andrew, I'm here to answer your questions. Let me just finish the question. So what's changed since then? What's changed is energy bills are now forecast to be a few £100s higher than we had estimated when I announced that support. So it's reasonable for the government to respond by providing a bit more support where it can, accepting that it can't solve all problems. And this is one of the few levers available to government to pull quickly to get support to millions of people. If I become Prime Minister at the beginning of September and energy bills go up in October, there is no time to design something else that would be a more perfect way of helping people. You've got to work with what you've got. And actually, VAT is it is a blunt instrument. I stick by what I said.
No, you said it disproportionately benefits the wealthy.
And it does, but it provides support to everybody. And if you've got 4 weeks after becoming Prime Minister to put in place a policy that will help 30 million households, this is pretty much the only lever left.
So that's all you're going to do?
It comes on top of providing £1,200 of support already for the most vulnerable families.
That was to deal with the price rise of energy in April of this year.
No, it wasn't, Andrew.
There's even more coming down. So there's no more coming down other than what you've announced.
Andrew, you have to remember, I stood up in May when we had an estimate from Ofgem about what would happen to the price cap in October, which at that point we expected to be £2,800.
It's going to be over 3,000 now.
And that's why, on top of the support that I announced in May to kick in autumn and winter, I've said I would do more. And the easiest way to do more, accepting that it's not perfect, is to reduce VAT on energy.
But hold on.
So there is already support in place for the autumn and winter, but we need to do more, and that is the easiest thing to do. And look, Andrew, I've been in government.
It's also marginal, Mr. Sunak, because energy bills are going to go up by about another £1,000 this October.
And that's why I announced support. That's why I announced support worth £1,200.
Your VAT suspension is about £150 for the average bill. It barely touches the side. Bills will still go up by £850.
It comes on top of the support that I've already announced for the autumn and winter, which is worth up to £1,200 for the most vulnerable families. So it's additional to that, Andrew. And the reason it's additional is because we knew bills were going to go up. I announced support to help, But now the situation is worse, and I'd like to do more, and this is the easiest lever that government can pull. It's not perfect. I'm not going to pretend that it is perfect. But at this point, if I became Prime Minister in September, you'd have weeks to put in place help. This is the only lever available.
It wasn't just suspending VAT on energy bills that you opposed. You also opposed the windfall tax, though like your VAT change, you finally said, I'll have a windfall tax. I mean, Shell has made a record $20 billion in the first half of this year alone. 20 billion. It's done multi-billion buyback of its own shares. I mean, there's a windfall if ever there was one. You were wrong to oppose that, weren't you? They deserve a windfall tax.
They do, and I put one in place.
And you were against it.
And the situation changed. And when the facts
changed... Why did it change? You knew that the windfall profits were coming.
We did not know how high and how long oil prices would stay at those levels for. And when it was clear that this situation was going to last longer and be more severe, I took the decision, which, by the way, lots of people criticised me for and disagreed with, I took the decision that it was right to levy a windfall profit in these exceptional circumstances on these companies.
To be consistently inconsistent on all these things. You were against a windfall tax, now you're in favour. You were against suspending VAT, now you're in favour. You raised any national insurance, but then you had to come back and raise the threshold for national insurance to cut it a little bit. On corporation tax, you've got all sorts of incentives to mitigate the raise. I mean, you just seem to be all over the place on tax.
No, actually, that's what tax reform looks like, Andrew.
This is tax reform?
Yeah, let's talk about corporation.
No, tax reform.
Let's talk about corporation tax, which you mentioned there at the end of your list. I'm trying to move to a system that means that we are internationally competitive, but also that we actually encourage the types of activity that drive growth and productivity. And that system means we have a higher rate, which is still, by the way, the lowest in the G7, the fourth lowest in the G20, exempts small businesses from the increase, combined with tax incentives, big tax cuts, for business investment in capital and business investment in R&D.
That is a reform. Massive tax cuts.
That is a reform. That is a reform of the tax system, which will drive growth and productivity.
And investments flatlining.
Yeah, because we've also had Omicron in the middle of all of that.
It's flatlining now as well. We're over that. It's still flatlining.
Because there's a lot of uncertainty hanging over the economy.
It will fall.
Yes, and if you talk to businesses...
That's your tax.
Well, hang on. If you talk to businesses, why don't you talk to the CBI and businesses and ask them what they think would make the difference to their business investment? Do you know what they say?
Okay.
They say that if you cut the tax on business investment, we will invest more. That's what business says. That's what they've said to me.
Good luck to see if we do that. You justified raising taxes to produce more money for the NHS. Yet even after they had this extra cash, waiting lists have risen from 6 million at the start of this year. They're now 6.7 million, and they're heading to over 9 million by 2024. So you broke a manifesto pledge not to raise taxes for extra cash for the NHS, and waiting lists are still set to rise 50%. Did you know that when you stumped up the cash?
First of all, you talked about manifesto pledges, Andrew, right? And you pick on that one. You know, in our manifesto...
That's the one you broke.
Well, you know, in our manifesto, we also said that we would have debt lower at the end of the Parliament than the beginning. We also said that we wouldn't borrow for day-to-day spending.
Why is this money not making any difference?
You made a very pointed comment about breaking manifesto promises.
Deal with the NHS.
And I will in a second, without recognising that we had a set of manifesto promises about fiscal policy, taxes, borrowing and spending. Do you know what happened? We got hit by a pandemic. A once-in-a-century event, and that meant things changed. So yes, were we not able to keep the manifesto promise on tax? We weren't, but we also weren't able to keep the manifesto promise on borrowing and debt, and I'm also trying to prioritise that. But let's turn to the NHS, because you're absolutely right.
Why are waiting lists going to be close to 10 million?
So I completely agree. It's right that we fund the NHS properly, but it's equally important that we get the reform we need so we get value for money out of that. And that's why I've published a plan, a comprehensive plan to tackle the waiting list. It will be one of my priorities as Prime Minister to get to grips with them. There's a range of things we can do.
What's the major thing you would do?
Well, structurally, I would set up a task force approach to dealing with it.
So a task force is going to get waiting lists down. There are 10 million people on them in 2 years' time.
Well, it was a task force that helped us get the vaccine rollout going, Andrew.
That was a much more specific issue.
Well, no, actually, this is also a specific issue. What we need to do is create more elective surgical hubs because they are an efficient way to cut through the elective surgery.
You're going to create how many?
We're going to create over 100. Right?
And that's going to make it. That's going to get the waiting list down.
Yes, it will, Andrew. Because if you do elective surgery in a specialised, dedicated unit, it's far more productive than doing it inside of hospitals. I'll tell you what you asked. Let me tell you the other things we're going to do.
I just wanted the main one.
Well, there's not just one thing. These are complex problems, Andrew. They don't lend themselves to just one simple solution.
No, but their problems have got worse under your government's reign. There are now 300,000 people
Andrew, let's just remember, I also left the government, and now I want to change.
Only a few days ago.
Well, I want to do things differently. As Prime Minister, I want to bring grip to this problem, and I've set out a very clear plan to do it.
Many of them watching this programme, perhaps. 300,000 people have been on a waiting list for a year or more. What are you going to do about that?
Yes, I think that's unacceptable.
Would you wait for a year?
No, I think this is unacceptable. Many people watching are probably thinking, well, I should go private. And I've said I don't want them to have to do that.
But they are going private.
Yes, and they shouldn't have to.
Numbers.
Yeah, and that's what I've said very clearly. That's why I've set out a plan. It was one of the first policy announcements of my campaign.
Okay.
We need more elective surgical hubs. We need more community diagnostic centres. We need to use technology to cut through all the way that we do the actual appointment scheduling to free up clinicians' time. And we need to make sure that we call out poor leadership in the NHS, because there are great examples of good leadership, and they know how to do it, and we should learn from them. I will bring the same grip and urgency that I brought to helping this country get through the pandemic, delivering things like furlough in record time.
That's fine.
I will bring that to gripping the NHS waiting list problem as well.
We've got about 6 minutes left. Let's look at another matter. Sending illegal migrants to Rwanda. None has gone so far, but you've said you'll get it, quote, off the ground and operating at scale. That's your words. Since Rwanda says it has capacity for only 200, how would you do that?
That's what the initial capacity is about. And this is a pilot programme that we've negotiated with Rwanda at first.
It's cost 120 million.
Yes. And we need to make sure that we get value for that, which means we need to make it work.
That's 600,000 per migrant. It would be cheaper to send them to board at your old public school in Winchester.
Yeah. So what we need to do is make sure that the deterrent effect of this programme deters thousands of people from coming across the channel into the UK. Because you know how much we're spending today on hotels? £5 million a day.
You're about to spend 600,000 per head if you ever do get anyone to go to Rwanda.
But what we need to do is get this up and running. And then if we can get it up and running and successful, and it will serve as a strong deterrent effect, we then won't have tens of thousands of people coming here, which are costing us $5 million.
Is a deterrent effect. None.
That's
still pouring across the channel.
That's just because we've just started, Andrew. So my priority is to make sure that we make that policy work. And if we can make that policy work, which is the right thing to do, because we do have to tackle this issue, then if it means that tens of thousands of people are not coming here, then we will save over £1 billion a year.
The practice I'm worried about. Now, you also want a cap, even on valid asylum seekers who come here legally. Have you had any legal advice that that would not be against international law?
Yes, I think Parliament rightly should be sovereign about these matters.
No, but have you had legal advice that that would not be against international law?
No, I don't believe it would be.
Well, but have you had legal advice?
Well, I'm not in government at the moment, Andrew, so I can't get advice from the Attorney General.
You can. This city's awash with lawyers.
Well,
you can get plenty.
From the advice I have, that it is. And I think this is, you bring up a broader problem, right? So we clearly have a problem with human rights law in this country that is making it difficult for us to achieve our objectives. That's why we're passing a British Bill of Rights, which will help with all of these things. That's why I've suggested moving away from the ECHR definition of asylum to the Refugee Convention definition, which is still an international legal standard, but narrower. If we do these things, we will be able to make progress on this problem. But I'm not going to pretend it's easy. This is a complicated problem.
Is there not something unsavoury about the son of a successful middle-class migrants prepared to turn away asylum seekers with a valid claim?
No, there is nothing wrong about that. And it's in fact because I am that person.
Come here legally?
Yes, it's because my family and millions like them were welcomed here legally. This country has a proud and compassionate. This country has a proud and compassionate history of taking people in. But it is right that that process is legally, that is orderly, and that it is controlled. That's the type of system that I want to deliver. You're not going to
turn away even legal asylum seekers?
Because there is a finite amount of asylum seekers that we can integrate and accommodate. And I think most reasonable people would agree with that. And it's totally, of course, at any moment in time, Andrew, There are probably 1 billion people that would love to move to the UK because this is an amazing country. Right? But we clearly can't accept all of those, and we have to be practical about that. Where we can accept people, we should, legally, and those who are trying to come here illegally, we should be very firm about stopping.
You talked a lot about your supposedly ordinary origins, your background. So why, when you were young, did you say you had no working-class friends?
I mean, Andrew, we all say silly things when we're students, but I've talked about my background. My family, as you said, were welcomed here as migrants.
No, we know that. I feel I almost know them personally myself. I've heard so much about it. So it was just wrong when you said that.
You know, I'm glad. I grew up working in my mum's pharmacy.
No, we know all that.
And you don't grow up doing that unless you actually interact with lots of people. And I spent my time making sure that we served our community. And my parents worked incredibly hard to provide opportunities for me. And that's ultimately why I want to be Prime Minister, Andrew, because this country allowed my family to provide a better opportunity and future for me. And as Prime Minister, I want to do the same thing for everybody's children and grandchildren.
I just thought someone of their background as so humble as you is why they didn't have working class friends. But let's move on. On judgment, was it not bad judgment to think you could be Chancellor residing in Downing Street and yet your wife could remain a non-dom for tax purposes?
Well, let's take a step back. I'm the one running for office and not my wife. But
no, I'm talking about when you were Chancellor.
Yeah, but I'm the one running for office and not my wife. But my wife is also from abroad.
I understand.
And over several months ago, we addressed this thing and she resolved the situation.
Only when it became public.
She addressed the situation and made a statement about it. And I fully
support her decision. Being a non-dom is not automatic. You have to apply for it. So it meant that when ordinary families were struggling to make ends meet, you were whacking up their taxes. Your family was enjoying millions in tax exemptions.
No, my wife was following the rules that applied to her situation.
Only because she had applied to be a non-dom.
You are a non-dom as a matter of law. How you choose to file your taxes is a choice.
You can choose not to be a non-dom as a matter of tax status.
No, that's just simply not right. You can choose to how you file your tax returns.
She is not paying British tax.
Yes, but her status is determined by law because she is abroad and she has her home abroad. And she does pay British tax and always has on all her British earnings.
Oh, yes, which is the non-dom status, but not on her international.
She chose to resolve that situation.
It just seems a misjudgment, wasn't it?
Well, she chose to resolve that situation. And these things, as I discovered and learnt myself, are difficult when it comes to your family. But I've learned from that experience, and I'm confident that experience has actually made me better suited to now lead.
20 seconds. When you look at all this that we've talked about tonight, can you assure the people watching tonight that you have the experience to be Prime Minister in a few seconds?
People have seen me lead this country's economy through some incredibly challenging times over the past 2 years. They see me do it well. They've seen me do it with compassion. And I will bring exactly those same qualities to running this country as Prime Minister.
Rishi Sunak, we thank you for being here tonight. Now, we also wanted to interview the other contender for Tory leader, Liz Truss. She declined our invitation. Her choice, of course. But that invitation still remains open. This has been an Andrew Neil Show special on Channel 4. Thanks for watching and have a very good night.